Around 1890, on the northern edge of the Great Plains, the smell of dried buffalo meat and wood smoke had clung to the roof of the low house since many winters before. The wind swept close to the ground, forcing its way through the cracks in the door, while the mother used an iron poker to pull the glowing coals closer together. The firewood had to burn until morning. She placed the black pot on the fire, poured in water that had been left to settle in a large earthen jar, and tilted her head to listen to the first gentle vibration beneath the bottom of the. Before America had fast food, dinner was cooked from the land, water, the smoke, and padions. Spread across the hide in the center of the table were a handful of dried corn, a small bowl of beans, a few wrinkled dark-colored berries, and a hard piece of pemmican resting neatly in the palm of a hand. Near the doorway, strips of dried meat hung high above the damp air. Beneath the table, a basket of acorns still rested inside their shells. Everything on the table had passed through human hands many weeks earlier, when the berries still grew on the bushes, the corn still stood on its stalks, and the meat still had to be sliced thin, dried near the smoke, and packed with rendered fat. The child sat close to the warmth, watching the wooden spoon gently scrape across the bottom of the pot. The child waited to see which ingredient would be added first. Dinner in those days had very little to do with personal preference. The family needed to know whether the food that remained would be enough to share around the table and whether the warmth inside each bowl would carry their bodies through a windy night. A single piece of pemmican could sustain a hunter through an entire snowy day. Corn, beans, and squash could be simmered into a stew that fed 4 or 5 people. Bitter acorns had to be cracked, ground, and washed through many changes of water before becoming flour for bread. Even a bone that had already been stripped clean returned to the fire to make another pot of broth. Those dishes existed because people needed to make it to the following day. By 2026, an ordinary hamburger costs about $5 to $8. A frozen pizza usually costs about $6 to $10, while a fried chicken meal delivered for a family can exceed $30. Meanwhile, a pot of Three Sisters stew made with corn, beans, and squash usually cost about $9 to $13 for 4 or 5 people. Each bowl costs about $2 to $3. A bowl of green corn mush can cost from $1.50 to $3, while a small pot of wojapi made from berries usually costs about $8 to $12. The modern kitchen pays for speed. The old kitchens paid with time, hard work, and the memory of the seasons. If meals like these still hold meaning for you, follow the channel and pull your chair a little closer. The recipe box still holds many recipe cards waiting to be opened. Inside are dried meat mixed with rendered fat for long hunting journeys, bread made from wild nuts that had to be washed until every trace of bitterness disappeared, and corn processed with wood ash long before anyone gave vitamins. And the 25 dishes ahead are 25 ways that people learn to read the land, the water, the wind, and the seasons. The first pot begins with berries, water, and a gentle fire. A wooden spoon slowly draws through the deep reddish-purple mixture as it thickens at the bottom of the pot. The 25th dish begins there. From a pot of wojapi to a piece of pemmican. One dish preserves summer, the other prosed human strength. Around 1885, across the Great Plains, dried choke cherries were poured into a small earthen pot as the sun disappeared beyond the prairie. At first, they floated quietly on the surface of the water. Then their wrinkled skins gradually softened, and the red color spread into a deep purple beneath the rising heat. The grandmother stirred steadily with a wooden spoon, polished smooth by years of use, occasionally pressing a few berries gently against the side of the pot. The aroma of ripe fruit filled the kitchen. The children quietly left their games, gathered close to the edge of the table, and watched as the thickening sauce slowly clung to the back of the spoon. The 25th dish is wojapi, a familiar berry sauce of the Lakota people and many other communities across the Great Plains. During the year 1885, berries were gathered in season, dried beneath the sun, and stored in leather bags or woven baskets for use throughout the cold months. When it was time to cook, they were soaked until soft, kept over a low fire, and stirred slowly until the liquid thickened. Some families added a little honey or maple syrup, while others kept the natural tartness of the berries untouched. In 2026, a small pot serving 4 people usually costs about $7 to $11, or roughly $2 to $3 per serving. The price appears on the receipt, but the flavor lives in the time the cook patiently waits for the berries to soften on their own. The bowl of sauce is passed around the table, the first piece of bread is gently dipped into it, and the spoon slowly scrapes up the last bit still clinging to the bottom of the pot. Summer seems to remain alive within that deep reddish-purple color, and the rhythm of the story changes. Around 1750, a hunter tightened the leather pouch at his side before leaving camp, while the morning mist still hung low over the ground. Inside were several firmly pressed pieces of pemmican, dark as smoke-cured wood. The 24th dish was made from lean meat sliced thin, dried, pounded into fine pieces, and mixed with rendered fat, but sometimes with crushed berries added as well. A small batch, prepared this way today, would usually cost about $12 to $18, divided into several portions that could last for many days of travel. Each piece fit neatly into the palm of a hand, accompanying its owner through cold winds, open grasslands, and long distances. It completed its purpose long before it ever had the chance to be praised for its flavor. More than 2 centuries later, that same idea appeared on store shelves in a different form. The 23rd dish, tonka bar, was introduced around 2007, combining buffalo meat and cranberries into a small, individually wrapped bar. It usually costs about $3 to $5 each. People tear open the wrapper, take a few bites, and continue their journey. The packaging has changed, and so has the pace of life. The question remains exactly as it did for generations before. How do you carry enough strength when the kitchen is far away? Pemmican belonged to long journeys. The travelers returned to cultivated fields, and the large pot resting in the center of the kitchen, another story began, one in which corn, beans, and squash grew together on the same land before meeting again at the family dinner table. The 3 sisters, acorns and green corn, dishes that cannot be cooked in a hurry. Around 1100, in a field in North America, the corn had already grown tall before the bean vines reached up to wrap themselves around the stalks. Squash spread across the ground, its broad leaves holding moisture beneath the sun. At the end of the growing season, all 3 were brought into the kitchen. The beans went into the pot first, resting for a long time in gently simmering water. The corn was added afterward. Pieces of winter squash went in last, keeping their sharp edges for a few moments before gradually softening, breaking apart around the edges, and thickening the stew. The 22nd dish is 3 Sisters stew, a stew made from corn, beans, and squash. Every region used different varieties of crops and different seasonings, but every serving brought all 3 together on the same spoon. That pot had truly begun many months earlier. The seeds had been saved, planted, weeded, harvested, and stored through the cold season. In 2026, one pot serving 5 people usually costs about $8 to $13, or nearly $2 per bowl. The mother served the first portion to the youngest child before dividing the rest equally among everyone else. Some stews had already been in the making long before the fire was ever lit. Around 1500, beneath the oak trees of California, a woman knelt to gather acorns into a basket. The 21st dish, acorn bread, required its real work to begin only after she returned home. The shells were cracked open. The kernels were ground into a fine meal with stones. The meal was placed in a basket or on clean sand and rinsed through many changes of water to wash away the tannins. The child watched the adults replace the water for the 3rd time, then the 4th. The mother touched a little of the meal to her tongue, tasted the bitterness that remained, and continued rinsing. Today, acorn flour can cost between $10 and $16 for about 450 grams. One batch of 6 to 8 loaves usually costs about $11 to $18. The acorns gathered from the ground cost almost nothing, but the hands preparing them paid with many hours of cracking, grinding, rinsing, and tasting. Once the bitterness had faded, the dough was shaped into loaves and baked slowly on hot stones or in the ashes. Some loaves became gentle in flavor only after every trace of bitterness had been washed away. Around 1800, a cold, dry morning in the Southwest began with green cornmeal being slowly sprinkled into a pot of hot water. The 20th dish is green corn mush of the Hopi and Navajo peoples. The hand had to stir constantly to prevent the meal from clumping, and the long spoon had to scrape the bottom so the mush would not stick. The liquid gradually turned a bluish-green color, while the aroma of ground corn filled the low kitchen. In 2026, one bowl usually costs between $1.50 and $3.50. Depending on whether it is served with milk, honey, or berries. The father ate before leaving for work. The child blew gently across each spoonful. The grandmother scraped the portion clinging to the bottom of the pot into her own bowl last. The three sisters came from the fields. Acorns came from the forest floor. Green corn carried the color of the dry land. Farther away, beside cold lakes and wide grasslands, edible grains grew upon the water, while a great animal could nourish an entire community with its meat, fat, hide, and bones. Wild rice, buffalo meat, and a pot of bones. The dinners of the wide open land around 1800 in a shallow lake in Minnesota. The morning mist still hung low among the wild rice stalks that stood taller than a person's shoulders. One person pushed a wooden canoe forward with a pole. The person seated behind used 2 wooden sticks to bend the rice stalks over the canoe and gently tap them. Ripe grains fell into the bottom of the canoe with a steady, scattered patter. Some grains remained over the following season and went back into the water to grow again the following season. The 19th dish is Ojibwe wild rice with cranberries. Anuman is the seed of an aquatic grass, connected to the northern lakes and the harvest season long before the year 1800. After the canoe returned, the grain still had to be dried, parched, danced upon, or pounded to loosen the hulls, then carefully winnowed. When it was finally simmered, the dark outer hull split open to reveal the lighter grain inside. Cranberries were added near the end, with wild onions and toasted seeds mixed in whenever they were available. In 2026, one serving usually costs about $4 to $6, while a version containing a larger variety of seeds can cost as much as $8. Every bowl still carries the memory of a cold morning on the lake, damp clothing, and hands made tired from striking one rice stalk after another. Leaving the water behind, the story moves toward the grasslands. Between approximately 1750 and 1850, a piece of buffalo meat was placed near glowing coals on the Great Plains. The 18th dish is roasted buffalo with juniper berries. Berries were crushed in a stone bowl and rubbed onto the meat together with a little salt and herbs. The cook spread the coals apart, laid down the meat, and slowly turned it so the lean portions would not dry out. Fat dripped onto the coals with a brief sizzling sound, filling the air with the scent of meat, grass, and tree resin that clung to clothing and hair. A homemade serving today usually costs about $8 to $13. Adults sliced the meat and gave the most tender portions to the children and the elderly. Behind every piece of meat were the hide, the sinew, the fat, and the bones, all carefully saved for later use. The meat was gone. The 17th dish was only just beginning. Around 1750, a section of buffalo bone was placed upon a stone and cracked open to expose the marrow. Bones were dropped into water and simmered for a long time in a pot or with heated stones that were replaced one after another. The fat that rose to the surface was skimmed off and saved. Broth was used to soften corn and beans or stretched into the following meal. In 2026, one large pot usually costs about $12 to $25 and can be divided into 6 to 8 bowls. Sometimes abundance lies in knowing how to use the very last part. But the next dish must be told with greater care, because behind the golden dough puffing up in the pan lies a history heavier than the aroma of hot fat still lingering in the kitchen. 3. Bread, tamales, and hominy. 3 ways of turning cornmeal, flour, rations into a real meal. Around 1870, in a makeshift kitchen on the dry lands, flour from government rations was poured into a chipped enamel bowl. The mother added water, a little salt, and kneaded the dough with fingertips still coated in grease. It was a kind of flour unfamiliar to the farming traditions her family had once known. But the children were already sitting near the fire waiting. The skillet had begun to give off its heat. The 16th dish is fry bread, often eaten with wojapi, honey, or savory dishes. Between approximately 1860 and 1890, this bread became closely associated with the period when many indigenous communities were forcibly displaced and had to make do with flour, fat, sugar, and salt from government-issued rations. The mother divided the dough, stretched each piece into a flat round, and lowered it into the hot fat. The dough sank for a moment before puffing up, its edges stretching outward and turning golden. In 2026, one basic piece of fry bread usually costs about 75 cents to $1.25. Served with wojapi or honey, one portion usually costs about $2.50 to $4. Bread may be warm, tender, and cherished across generations, but the story behind it still bears the marks of circumstances that were imposed upon the people who made it. Leaving behind the sound of sizzling fat, the kitchen turns to the steam rising from the cooking pot. The 15th dish is tamales wrapped in corn husks, already widely present throughout the Southwest and Mesoamerica around 1400. Husks were soaked until soft and stacked neatly. One person spread the masa, another added beans, squash, peppers, or meat for the filling, while someone else folded the edges and tied each bundle. As the tamales steamed, the aroma of the heated corn husks escaped before the firm dough pulled cleanly away from the wrapper. One homemade tamale today usually costs between $1 and $2.50, while a serving of 2 or 3 typically costs about $5 to $10. The work is slow when done alone, but around a crowded table, each bundle is completed in a steady rhythm. The 14th dish begins with the ashes left behind after the fire. Long before 1400, many indigenous communities used wood ash water or lime to soften dried corn. The kernels were soaked, cooked, rubbed to remove their outer hulls, and carefully rinsed before being simmered with beans, squash, onions, peppers, or meat. In 2026, one pot of vegetarian hominy stew, serving 5 people, usually costs about $9 to $14. The mother knew which ashes should be used, when the water needed to be changed, and exactly when the kernels had become soft enough beneath her fingertips. The child watched, remembered, and repeated the process in another season. Fry bread carries the warmth of government rations. Tallies preserve the work of an entire family within every folded corn husk. Hominy preserves knowledge passed through many generations. As the cold season slowly gives way, the kitchen begins waiting for green shoots, fruit, and cactus buds that inexperienced hands would struggle to gather. When winter has just retreated, a bowl of green soup, a pot of forest tea, and a sour drink that needs no lemon. Around 1810, after a long winter in the northern forests, the snow melted first along the edges of the creeks. Among the layers of fallen leaves, a few young nettle shoots began to appear. A woman wrapped a piece of cloth around her hand, bent down to gather the tender shoots one by one, and carried them back to a kitchen still scented with wood smoke. After many months of living on dried meat, corn, and dried beans, a splash of green announced that the land had begun providing food once again. The 13th dish is early spring nettle soup. The young shoots were carefully washed and then blanched in boiling water, causing the stinging hairs to soften almost immediately. Bone broth or plain water was heated first, with wild onions, potatoes, or corn added before the nettles went in last to preserve their green color. Between the years 1800 and 1850, many forest communities welcomed the new season with a bowl of soup like this. Today, one pot serving about 4 people usually costs around $9 to $15. Mothers still set aside one bowl for the person who had gone to gather firewood and had not yet returned. The first bowl of soup of the season always waited until everyone was around the table. As night fell, the 12th dish took over the warmth left behind by the pot of soup. Around 1820, a few sprigs of evergreen needles were gently crushed and steeped in hot water. The aroma of tree resin spread throughout the small room. The grandmother poured the tea through a thin cloth and handed the wooden cup to the person who had just returned from the forest. Today, it's 1 cup prepared from commercially available safe ingredients, usually costs about $1 to $2. What has been preserved is not the price, but the knowledge of recognizing the correct tree species to bring the scent of the entire forest into the kitchen. The 11th dish begins on a summer day around 1850. Clusters of red sumac berries were soaked in cold water, gently rubbed, and then strained through cloth, creating a pale pink drink with a mild tart flavor. Today, 1 pitcher usually costs about $3 to $5. That land had no lemons, yet it still offered people a drink that soothed the throat after a dusty afternoon. Nettles brought the first green of the season. Evergreen needles held the warmth of a cold night. Sumac carried the tartness of summer. Farther toward the desert, dinner began instead with sharp spines, wild fruit, and hands patient enough to touch what others usually walked past. When winter has just retreated, a bowl of green soup, a pot of forest tea, and a sour drink that needs no lemon. Around 1810, after a long winter in the northern forests, the snow melted first along the edges of the creeks. Among the layers of fallen leaves, a few young nettle shoots began to appear. A woman wrapped a piece of cloth around her hand, bent down to gather the tender shoots, one by one, and carried them back to a kitchen still scented with wood smoke. After many months of living on dried meat, corn, and dried beans, that splash of green announced that the land had begun providing food once again. The 13th dish is early spring nettle soup. The young shoots were carefully washed and then blanched in boiling water, causing the stinging hairs to soften almost immediately. Bone broth or plain water was heated first, with wild onions, potatoes, or corn added before the nettles went in last to preserve their green color. Between the years 1800 and 1850, the forest communities welcomed the new season with a bowl of soup like this. Today, 1 pot serving about 4 people usually costs around $9 to $15. Others still set aside 1 bowl for the person who had gone to gather firewood and had not yet returned. The first bowl of soup of the season always waited until everyone was around the table. As night fell, the 12th dish took over the warmth left behind by the pot of soup. Around 1820, a few sprigs of evergreen needles were gently crushed and steeped in hot water. Aroma of tree resin spread throughout the small room. The grandmother poured the tea through a thin cloth and handed the wooden cup to the person who had just returned from the forest. Today, 1 cup prepared from commercially available safe ingredients usually costs about $1 to $2. What has been preserved is not the price, but the knowledge of recognizing the correct tree species to bring the scent of the entire forest into the kitchen. The 11th dish begins on a summer day around 1850. Clusters of red sumac berries were soaked in cold water, gently rubbed, and then strained through cloth, creating a pale pink drink with a mild tart flavor. Today, 1 pitcher usually costs about $3 to $5. That land had no lemons, yet it still offered people a drink that soothed the throat after a dusty afternoon. Nettles brought the first green of the season. Evergreen needles held the warmth of a cold night. Sumac carried the tartness of summer. Farther toward the desert, dinner began instead with sharp spines, wild fruit, and hands patient enough to touch what others usually walked past. In the desert, that was never cholla buds, prickly pears, and a pot of soup made from tiny seeds. Around 1840, in the Sonoran Desert, the sun had only just risen above the horizon, yet the ground had already begun to hold the day's heat. The woman carried a woven basket and a long wooden pair of tongs. Stopping in front of a cholla cactus covered with spines, she gripped each young bud, gave it a gentle twist, and dropped it into the basket. Every movement was slow because a single careless touch was enough for the tiny spines to cling tightly to the skin. The 10th dish is cholla buds, served with the sweetness of agave. Between approximately 1800 and 1850, the Tohono O'odham and many other communities of the Sonoran Desert harvested the buds while they were still young, removed the spines with fire and sand, then boiled or roasted them until tender. Today, one serving usually costs about $4 to $6, with just enough agave added to preserve the fresh green flavor of the buds. The true cost of the dish still lies in the hours spent beneath the sun and in the hands that know exactly where to reach between the rows of sharp spines. The 9th dish is far more colorful. The prickly pears were removed from the cactus with tongs, rolled in sand, or quickly passed through a flame to remove the tiny spines that were almost invisible. When cut open, the deep red-purple flesh-stained fingertips and the wooden spoon. Around 1800, many families slowly cooked down the juice to preserve its sweetness after the harvest season. A small batch prepared in the modern way usually costs about $12 to $18 and can be divided into several jars for later use. Even a thin layer of jam spread on bread is enough to bring the colors of summer back into the kitchen. The 8th dish begins with something much smaller. Around 1830, the whole family gathered beneath pinyon trees, collecting cones and patiently removing the pine nuts from inside. Some of the nuts were toasted, while others were ground into a fine paste and stirred into broth to make a lightly thickened soup. In 2026, one pot serving about 4 people usually costs between $12 and $19. The soup is eaten quickly, but every tiny nut inside it represents many hours spent gathering and shelling beneath the afternoon sun. The desert held its food within flower buds, ripe fruit, and pine nuts. Farther beyond, along the rivers and among the red rocks, dinner changed its form once again, where the skill of practiced hands became visible in every layer of dough, every fish, and every grain that had been preserved through many generations. River smoke, wild fruit, and paper-thin bread. Dishes that cannot be made with clumsy hands. Around 1800, along a mist-covered stretch of river, the woven fish trap was lifted from the water. Eels writhed over one another beneath the faint glow of the fire along the riverbank. A man held each eel firmly with a piece of coarse cloth, cleaned it, and hung it on a wooden rack. Smoke from the slow-burning fire gradually settled into every strand of the flesh, carrying that morning's catch through many weeks to come. The 7th dish is smoked eel. Throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, many communities living along rivers and coastal regions depended upon the migration of fish to build their food stores. The eels were hung high above the fire, but slowly turned through gentle smoke, allowing the flesh to become firm while retaining its richness. Today, one serving usually costs about $8 to $12 when prepared at home, while traditionally smoked products can cost as much as $25. The person tending the fire learned to add one small piece of firewood at a time because it was the smoke that preserved the meal for the long days ahead. After the scent of burning wood comes the deep purple color of wild cherries. The 6th dish is made from ripe choke cherries, crushed into a puree and spread into thin sheets beneath the sun. Between approximately 1700 and 1800, many communities across the Great Plains preserved the berry harvest in this way. Once the fruit leather had dried, the mother rolled it into narrow strips to carry along on journeys. A batch prepared using modern methods usually costs about $10 to $16. Every piece preserved a little of summer's sweetness through the long days of travel. The fifth dish is peaky bread of the Hopi people, prepared for many generations across northeastern Arizona. Blue cornmeal was mixed into a very thin batter and brushed onto a heated stone, forming a sheet of bread so delicate that light could pass through it. The maker had to spread the batter quickly, lift it evenly, and fold it immediately while it was still soft. A batch of ingredients today costs only about $7 to $11. Handmade peaky bread is usually far more expensive because its true value lies in the skill of the hands rather than in the amount of cornmeal. Smoke preserves the fish. Sunshine preserves the fruit harvest. A heated stone preserves the memory of many generations. Ahead, the story returns once more to the earth, to pollen, roots roasted deep beneath the fire pit, the dishes that bring this journey to its final two places. For the final dish, golden pollen, pit-roasted camas, and salmon preserved beside the fire. Around 1820, on a calm morning beside a marsh, golden flower heads were gently bent over a low basket. Adults shook them lightly, while the children held the sides of the basket with both hands. The pollen fell as softly as dust, settling on sleeves and between the fingers. A single hurried step was enough to send an entire morning's harvest drifting back into the air. The fourth dish is golden pollen cakes made from marsh plants, mixed with cornmeal or ground seeds. Throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, many parts of wetland plants were used according to the season. The pollen was carefully sifted, mixed with meal, water, and a little fat, shaped into flat cakes, and pressed onto heated stones. Today, one batch usually costs about $8 to $13, or nearly $2 per cake. The golden color remains after baking, together with a delicate grain aroma and the fingerprints of those who walked slowly enough to keep the harvest from being blown away by the wind. The third dish disappears from sight the moment it begins. Around 1800, camas bulbs were carefully identified, dug from the ground, cleaned of soil, and placed into a pit lined with heated stones and damp leaves. The pit was completely covered. It fell while the meal remained beneath the earth, gradually changing from firm to tender and from mild to deeply sweet. Edible camas is rare today, and one small serving can cost between $5 and $9. But its true value lies in knowing how to identify the correct plant, maintain the heat throughout the night, and wait until morning before opening the still warm earth. Around 1850, beside a river in the Pacific Northwest, the second dish returned with the season. Salmon was cleaned, split open, and fastened to a cedar frame set at an angle near the fire. The person tending the fish adjusted its distance from the flames, turned the frame with the wind, and watched the fat drip onto the glowing coals. A homemade serving today usually costs about $8 to $14. Once cooked, the fish was shared among the elders, the children, and those who had worked around the fire. The aroma of smoke remained on the salmon's skin, in people's clothing, and throughout the air beside the river. Salmon belonged to the season of returning waters, the journey of the fish upstream, and the hands that shared every portion. After the scent of cedar smoke, the story grows quiet. The final dish begins beneath the forest canopy, where hard nuts fall to the ground and the steady rhythm of a wooden pestle echoes beside a grandmother whose hands had known the motion for a very long time. Canucci, final nut sop, and the kitchen where the fire never truly went out. Around 1890, after a late autumn wind had swept through, hickory nuts covered the forest floor of a Cherokee community. The grandmother bent down to gather them, one by one, gently shook each nut in the palm of her hand, and placed it into a cloth bag only if the kernel still sounded fiery. The time she returned home, the bag looked completely full, yet after removing the outer husks, sorting out the spoiled nuts, and cracking the hard shells, only enough remained for one small pot. The first dish is canucci, the traditional hickory nut soup of the Cherokee people. The steady sound of a wooden pestle striking the mortar echoed through the kitchen as the nuts were pounded until they released their rich oil. The mixture was blended with hot water, strained to remove the shell fragments, and slowly cooked until a thin layer of oil shimmered across the surface of the soup. Around 2026, it's one pot yielding 5 or 6 bowls usually costs between $15 and $24, or about $3 to $5 per serving. That cost still does not include the days spent gathering the nuts, drying them, the many hours of pounding them by hand. What places canucci in the final position is not the complexity of its ingredients. Within one small pot of soup remain the traces of the entire journey from the season when the nuts fell in the forest, to the effort required to crack their hard shells, to the hands passing the knowledge from one generation to the next, and to the pot that was always divided into many bowls. Grandmother placed the first bowl before the oldest member of the family. The child who had helped gather the shells received the next bowl. The person returning after a day of working outdoors also had a share. But only at the very end did she tilt the pot and scrape the thick soup remaining at the bottom into her own bowl. Nettled very slowly, a few pieces of hickory shell still remained in the mortar. The wooden spoon rested across the top of the pot, and only the glow of red embers remained in the fire. The dishes that had come before were no longer fully present. Only the smallest traces remained. A streak of berry sauce on the spoon, the scent of smoke lingering in the wooden roof, a few kernels of corn caught along the side of the pot, and the sound of the wooden pestle that still seemed to echo through the house. People survived through many seasons by remembering those movements and repeating them whenever the season of falling nuts returned. Perhaps the history of a land is sometimes found not within the pages of books, but in a pot that is almost empty, and yet still holds enough to give everyone around the table one warm bowl. The kitchen had grown quiet after dinner. The pot of canucci was pulled away from the glowing embers, with only a thin layer of soup remaining at the bottom, reflecting the fading firelight. Outside on the porch, the late autumn wind carried a few more hickory nuts down onto the dry leaves. Tomorrow, someone would bend down to gather them once again. The sound of the wooden pestle would echo through the kitchen, and a child would stand nearby, watching for a long time before being allowed to hold the pestle for the very first time. The foods of this land were never created to become something strange in the eyes of later generations. They simply and quietly kept warmth in the kitchen, kept people gathered around the table, and carried memories from one pair of hands to another. Stories like these make you look at a meal with a deeper sense of appreciation. Stay with the channel. There are still many old kitchens, many old harvest seasons, and many humble dishes waiting to have their stories told. It's one spoon, one cooking fire, and one dinner at a time.